And now I am pleased to welcome Norman Solomon, journalist and author of many books, including the one we're going to focus on this evening, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. Norman, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, I'm so glad to be part of this session.
Right on. I've just been really enjoying your book and finding just it's so rich to think about using the examples you give in the classroom and just thinking about how to teach our students media literacy skills and also how to help them understand US foreign policy better. That it's just such a treasure trove of information. And I just thought I'd begin with something that you wrote, because you write in it that the United States, nationalism masquerades as journalism. I love that line. Can you share some examples of how you see that happen? And do you think that nationalism also masquerades as education?
Well, a lot of it is so routine, we don't really give it a second thought. It sort of blends into the scenery. If a news reporter refers to us as America in the world, the perspective is what we are doing in on different parts of the planet. And then the specifics, a couple that come to mind offhand, we tend to think of or encourage to perceive the venerable journalist Walter Cronkite as the epitome of good journalism, but there's footage of him on CBS, and of course, then there were only three channels during the Vietnam War to speak of, and he would get off a jet bomber and say on camera on CBS Evening News, "That's a great way to fight a war, General." Or you fast forward a few decades and you have Dan Rather, also on CBS, on the evening news, pumping the hand of a general and saying, "Congratulations on a job well done." Or we had during the so called shock and awe with the bombing of Baghdad during the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, where on NBC and the other networks we had these remarkable statements from journalists saying it was like a tremendous light show. Or we had reporters like, anchors like Katie Couric telling the viewers, the millions of them, that uh, Operation Desert Storm had been virtually flawless. Well, we had hundreds of people who were incinerated in one attack on Baghdad in a uh, bomb shelter who were civilians, literally burned alive. And yet you have that sort of nationalism that comes to the fore that says, in effect, that any untoward or negative event that the United States is part of is an anomaly. And anything bad that happens that we can be attributed to as the US government, that is an anomaly. That the default is that we mean well, we do well, and that's what we do in the world. Right now, perhaps more than at any time in our lifetimes, educators are in the front line. Many journalists, especially in the United States, are keeping their heads down. They're running for cover. And we know there are all too many instances where teachers who are having the temerity to teach history or refer to current events in a matter of fact, accurate way are under pressure. And so I think it's doubly important for us to recognize that nationalism is a way of polluting the terrain through which we walk as people, as human beings, and it separates us. And so I just sort of sum up that whether it's journalists, whether it's teachers, we have the challenge to go higher than simple nationalism, to say that we're on a planet with 7 or 8 billion people and our fates are intertwined.
Mm, that's absolutely right. And I just love the way you reveal the humanity of the people that those nationalistic narratives hide. And my mom helped to work on the study that showed how many excess deaths were a product of the war in Iraq, and it really drove home for me uh, the mass death that was caused by our government that was often just hidden by the media. And in one of the epigraphs in War Made Invisible in your book, you quote Aldous Huxley, written in 1936, quote, "The propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human." I was hoping you could address how you see that happening right now with the situation in Gaza.
Unfortunately, there's a hierarchy of empathy in US media coverage, with some exceptions. And as I stress in the first chapter of War Made Invisible, the essence of propaganda is repetition. It's not what's exceptional. And I give an example, including to young people when I speak to folks, that if you watch a lot of TV, you don't just see one McDonald's commercial. If you watch a lot of TV, you see a lot. That's because it's about repetition. And so the ways in which human beings, who in this case are being terrorized, frankly, as well as maimed and sometimes killed, with the help of US military aid, they're largely objectified. And there's a sort of an arm's length tone and distancing that takes place. And the problem in this instance, I believe, is not that there is empathy towards the Israelis who were killed on October 7th. Of course, there should be complete empathy and condemnation for the terrible killing of those civilians. What's imbalanced is the relative lack of empathy, of humane and human connection. And let's face it, we have no way of knowing about people in Gaza right now except through journalism. And just in the last few days, again, we're told through news media in the United States in a sort of passive voice way that communications have not been functioning for the last few days. So it's even impossible when an outlet like NPR wants to talk to a doctor in a hospital in Gaza. They've lost touch with the doctor for a few days. It didn't happen as an act of God that there's no communication in Gaza. There are actions taken by the Israeli Defense Force, and we have to look at words like defense. It's
Hmm.
advertising, just like the US Defense Department, the Israeli Defense Force, really? Is that what they're engaged in? And they've made a choice to cut off communication in Gaza because basic information about what's happening to human beings is a threat. So it goes back to that principle that Aldous Huxley was alluding to way back in 1936, which is if we can distance ourselves, or we are induced to distance ourselves from the humanity of certain others, then all kinds of atrocities become possible.
Mm. Yeah, they do. I mean, it's breaking my heart every day to see what's happening in Gaza, the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of schools, the killing of journalists who are trying to actually get some truth out about what's happening. So that quote, I think, is just so critical to help us understand how that is allowed to occur. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Uh, and I wanted to expand the lens a little bit because you quote the brilliant writer Viet Thanh Nguyen, who wrote that, quote, "The severity of anti-Black racism is inseparable from the endurance of American imperialism." So I was hoping you could elaborate on the linkage between anti-Black racism and imperialism and militarism.
I grew up around Washington, D.C. during the 1960s when I was in high school. And I learned a lot, not per se from media. As a matter of fact, I learned very little from reading the Washington Post every day in terms of what was happening. But I learned a lot from music, and I learned a lot from lyrics of music, and I learned a lot from talking to people and listening to people. And when I learned that there was an encampment in Washington called Resurrection City, as a 16-year-old, I went down there. And what I subsequently learned about the vision of a Poor People's Campaign, and then later, 2 decades later, with the Jackson campaigns of 1984 and 1988, that vision of a rainbow coalition is a humanistic vision about what can be created in this country and the world. And after the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement was very clear about solidarity with people around the world. If the 20th century issue was the issue of the color line, the 21st century is also an issue of the color line, and not only in the United States. As a matter of fact, that gets to the broader lens that we're talking about. That's the planet.
Mm.
And this is another hot button issue, and it's hidden in plain sight. The so-called war on terror since October of 2001 with the initial attack on Afghanistan, when we step back and think about it and look at the data coming from the Brown University Costs of War project, for instance, the reality is that of all the people killed by Pentagon firepower in the last 22 years or so, virtually all of them are people of color. And yet we cannot find that talked about in US news media, on Capitol Hill. That is a sort of a hot stove topic that is not touched, even if people were aware of it. And yet, in the last few years, we've heard more and more, certainly in the last several years, about systemic racism. We've heard more about it, not nearly enough, but it's been a real step forward in terms of public discourse. And yet somehow we're encouraged to believe that systemic racism stops at the water's edge, that it only affects domestic government policy, it only affects institutions with purview and power over the United States internally. But of course, that's absurd. It's the same institutions, the same power blocks, and the same individual biases and trainings that have a view on the world. And I think it's important to emphasize that the United States does not bomb countries because they're inhabited by people of color. But when those countries are inhabited by people of color, it makes it easier for the US government to engage in warfare on those countries for all the same reasons that we have these pernicious and ongoing overt and covert aspects of institutionalized racism in the United States, from educational institutions to media to the so-called justice system to the prisons and the jails. So we need to, I think, we have an opportunity. It's not just a teaching moment, it's a teaching decade to say we can now look at systemic racism and systemic bias in a deep way and a wide way and understand not only the role of power centers within our country, but the role of the power centers based in the US for much of the rest of the world.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for making those connections. It's like Muhammad Ali, who refused to be drafted into the war in Vietnam, said, "No Vietnamese ever called me the N-word," right? My
Yeah.
fight is right here at home, and we need to start making those connections again today when we look at how much the US is spending to supply Israel with the weapons that are perpetrating the destruction of so many lives in Gaza. Thank you for that. I want to ask you another question before we move to some video clips to have you comment on. But in your book, you write about the protracted silences and the power of omissions that allow U.S. war making to go unchallenged. What are some of the key silences and omissions in our media and in our schools today?
The silences are just so important because they tell us tacitly what doesn't matter and about the people who don't matter and the events that don't matter. And a lot of this is a sort of a convenient amnesia. I think, for instance, of, say, Dick Cheney. He's been rehabilitated largely. He was greeted with open arms a year after the January 6th attack on the Capitol by Democrats and Republicans alike on Capitol Hill. We've had so many instances where people who engaged in, from the top, ordering aggression on another country, which according to the Nuremberg Tribunal judgment was the supreme international crime. And yet we had Ellen DeGeneres, we had Michelle Obama making a point of saying that George W. Bush, the former president, who had launched that war based on lies, that actually he was their friend, that they had the same values. We were told, we have the same values. We just have different politics. Well, what is the values of saying it's okay to attack another country based on deception, violating international law, causing so much death and destruction? So I think the silences are just so powerful, and it's in ways that omission, and paradoxically, you can have silences by commission because talking around it, making nice with those who actually should have been called to account and perhaps put on trial, that's a way of saying, doesn't really matter.
Mm,
All those Americans who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, no big deal. The people who lived there in much later numbers dying, no big deal. And it's also prefigurative. It's sort of a preemptive silence because it's saying, if we can forgive Dick Cheney and George W. Bush and hold them up as actual paragons of virtue, then when something like this might happen again, not only will those leaders not be called to account or prosecuted, but they will be held up in the future. So it's the annihilation, sort of, you might say, the preemptive annihilation of history, saying history won't matter. And there is an Orwell 1984 aspect of this. I do think that part of the role of authentic journalists and authentic educators is to break the silence.
mm. Yes. Yes. I hope everyone on this call will be breaking the silence with us in their classrooms this week and in the weeks and months to come. Thank you for that framework.
Sure.
And I want to move to look at some clips from the media that deal with the current attacks by Israel on Gaza. And I want to look at it from various perspectives because media literacy has always been something that's important to me in my classroom. You know, I've taught elementary, middle, and for 10 years at my alma mater, Garfield High School here in Seattle. And um, you know, a big focus in my classroom was helping students understand that every document that we either read or video that we saw all had a thesis, and that thesis was being created by someone who had an opinion and a viewpoint on the world. And I wanted them to not passively receive that information, uh, but actually analyze what is the argument in this text and do I agree with the argument in this text. So I would often have students create a T-chart when we watched a video, and on one side of the chart they would write what they saw and the other side they would write what they heard. and they would talk about how the images and the oral arguments put together a thesis and try to identify what that thesis was. So that's one strategy I could recommend for educators today. But let's play these clips, and then I would love to get your comment on what's going on with these clips and how educators could use them. All right, we'll start with this one from the nightly news.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. We'll show you some of what we saw in Ashkelon, closer to Gaza earlier, but we start here in Tel Aviv tonight, where for 6 days now the world has watched and waited for the full might of the Israeli response to the horrific attacks inflicted on it. Anticipated by many to be a massive invasion of the Gaza Strip, making good on its promise to destroy Hamas after last Saturday's brutal terrorist rampage in southern Israel. The toll keeps getting worse. 1,300 in Israel now reported killed, more than 1,500 lives lost in Gaza as Israel steps up its bombing. At least 27 Americans have been killed, and the fate of as many as 150 hostages, including some Americans, remains uncertain tonight. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who was here today, says the U.S. is doing everything it can to secure their release. I pressed him on when we spoke one-on-one. All as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza deepens. A UN agency estimates 340,000 Palestinians have been displaced as Israel's air campaign intensifies.
All right, and now we'll see from the same time period, the same day, another news clip from Democracy Now!
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Gaza's humanitarian crisis is deepening as Israel continues to pummel the besieged Palestinian territory with air and artillery attacks for a 6th straight day, reducing whole neighborhoods to rubble. Gaza's Ministry of Health says Israel's attacks have killed more than 1,350 Palestinians and wounded more than 6,000. More than 320 children are among the dead. Survivors have been seen searching the rubble of their homes for lost possessions and food.
We left our homes thinking we would return in an hour. We left our belongings, money, food, and everything we owned. Now there are 50 people left homeless without food, drink, water, or electricity. I do not know how we will provide food for our children. I am searching here under the rubble for even the remains of lentils and rice, even a little for my children.
Israel's energy minister said no basic resources or humanitarian aid, including water, will be allowed into Gaza until Hamas releases hostages. His warning came after Gaza's only power station ran out of fuel, plunging the territory into darkness. The International Committee of the Red Cross warned in a statement, quote, as Gaza loses power, hospitals lose power, putting newborns in incubators and elderly patients on oxygen at risk. Kidney dialysis stops and X-ray can't be taken. Without electricity, hospitals risk turning into morgues, they say.
Okay, and we wanted to show just one more clip. Those two were from the same day, so you early on, but I wanted to show one more clip and then get your comment.
Welcome to Democracy.
Extraordinary civilian death toll that has happened as a result of this war. Do you believe that anything that Israel has done in these 6 weeks of fighting has amounted to a war crime?
Of course not. Of course not. And it's like, let's not forget what Hamas started. They broke the first ceasefire, and then they attacked Israel and murdered over 1,200 innocent women, children, babies, everything, and brutalized it in the most unspeakable kinds of ways. And so that really is the ultimate, criminal war kinds of. This is absolutely an unequivocal attack to destroy Israel. And we must remember that that's how started all of this.
But are you comfortable, Senator, with the number of Palestinians who have lost their lives? 7,000 children, 15 or 16,000 civilians dead. Do you believe Israel is doing enough to minimize civilian casualties?
No, one death is too many. It's a tragic. I don't value any Palestinian child life any more than, or any less than my own child as well too. It's heartbreaking and it's awful. But I do fundamentally believe that Israel must destroy Hamas to achieve long changing conditions that allow for peace to prosper.
All right. Norman, can you help us make sense of what we're seeing in these various clips and how we might be able to use the media to teach our kids?
One aspect is the way in which adjectives are used. For instance, the NBC report, quite properly in the reportorial voice, referred to the Hamas attack on civilians as, quote, horrific. But we're not getting the same reportorial voice from that media outlet or other mainstream US outlets to use that kind of adjective to describe what the Israeli military is doing to the civilians in Gaza. So it's horrific when it's done to the Israeli civilians, according to media. It's unfortunate and sad when it's done to the civilians in Gaza. There's a similar problem with the use of the words like terrorists and terrorism. If we're going to use words like that, and then we can and could justifiably apply it to what Hamas does, then why is it that, to my knowledge, there has never been a big mainstream US media outlet reporting that the Israeli military is engaged in terrorism in Gaza? It's a complete disconnect. Because there's an unwritten rule that is so unconscious and in the pervasive atmosphere of US mass media that you would never do that. Can you imagine what would happen to a TV news anchor who matter-of-factly had just referred to the Hamas attack as terrorism, then went on to say that meanwhile, the Israeli forces engaged in more terrorism today in Gaza. I mean, leave your keys on the desk and don't let the door hit you on the way out. That's what would occur. And of course, journalists understand they basically, if they want their career, they would never dream of doing that. What we heard from Senator Fetterman is very typical, and that is to say Hamas started it. And so that seems to be a open-ended license to kill for the U.S. ally Israel. It's not logical because history doesn't start at point X just because we wanted to start at point X. There's a history going back months and years before it. You could talk about the Nakba. Who started this? It's not to find fault. It's to say that there's always a context. There's always a backstory that as human beings, it's better for us to understand because that's the way the real world operates. And when I heard the senator speak, it reminded me of something that I quote in the War Made Invisible book from then Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, when he was asked about the civilian deaths that were mounting up in Afghanistan after the US launched the so-called War on Terror in late 2001. And Rumsfeld said, make no mistake about it, every death in Afghanistan, whether it's Americans or Afghan civilians or anybody else, it's all the fault of al-Qaeda. Well, that's just a complete license to kill. Go around killing anybody you want, and it's all okay because you're not at fault. Well, that's a complete absolution for not only past war crimes, but future ones as well.
Yes. Well, I think you've given the educators here today so much to think about how to frame these issues and ways to raise this in the classroom. You know, in the book, you note that Biden requested a record 813 billion in military spending in 2023. And you write this, war budget sops up funds that could be devoted to healthcare, education, housing, job creation, and much more. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called military spending a demonic, destructive suction tube. How can teachers unions, parents, students, how can we all challenge these priorities?
The example you give, I think, is a great teaching moment, if you will, about the distant mirror of when Dr. King spoke in 1967. As I say in the book, he went down by the Riverside to Riverside Church in New York City. He got tremendous media abuse by pointing out what he called that terrible demonic suction tube. And here we are at the end of 2023, and most communities, you don't have to walk very far to see that absence of the healthcare, education, housing, the resources. And I think we have this opportunity. Maybe you could say it has something to do with what Paulo Freire talked about, that start with where people are and what they experience, and the deficits in basic social safety net, social services, public space, community. How is it that there's hardly any place to go that isn't bought and sold, where something is set up to sell you something? Where's our common space and community that nurtures everybody, not to require any money from them? And so there are so many countless aspects of how our society is suffering, not only as something happening far away, but nearby, where all of us of any age are having tremendous impact. And I think another aspect is the culture of violence and the tacit, absurd assumption, through omission, through silence, that literally millions of people, mostly men, can be run through boot camps, can be trained and encouraged to learn how to kill people and use firearms to do it. And then the theory is that somehow, or the pretense is somehow, there's an off switch, and they come home and all of them are suddenly discarding all of that training, all of the emotions, all the reflexes and psychological synapses, however you want to describe it. And I think the culture of violence is one of those through lines that we can really talk about, beginning where people are.
Yeah, you're breaking it all down this evening. I really appreciate this. And people may have seen in the chat that we dropped a link to resources for educators to teach more about Israel, Palestine, and war. So we hope that you check that out. And I also just wanted to point out that Rethinking Schools magazine just had an editorial in our new winter edition, inspired by your book. And we write, quote, "We need schools to nurture a disgust for war and to expose students to the human consequences of the U.S. war machine. We need young people to come to see themselves as activists for peace and justice, to recognize our common humanity and to do something about it." So I just wanted to recommend that Rethinking Schools also as a resource for educators here. As we move to our next question, and I wanted to also point that Sylvia has an article in the winter issue of Rethinking Schools magazine that describes our country's long history of activism against militarism in our schools. Peace activists and educators and veterans and labor organizers and social workers, clergy, And the socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, who went to prison for opposing World War I, said, quote, "I would no more teach school children military training than to teach them arson, robbery, or assassination." So how do we account for the weakness of the movement against militarism in our schools today?
Of course, schools are part of the society. The walls don't keep out all the different pressures, attitudes. Media is such a powerful educator, usually miseducator. And as you spoke in that memory and information about Eugene Debs, that aspect rarely taught about the history of World War I and the nonviolent, emphatic, articulate resistors. Someone earlier in our session mentioned Muhammad Ali, and I think it's very instructive. I know I'm old enough to remember the tremendous abuse that he took when he simply took a principled stand and he said, "You got it. You want to send me to prison? Okay, that's better than me going out and killing people who I have no reason whatsoever to want to harm at all." And I think that's very potentially instructive. And we have many examples. And Daniel Ellsberg's another one, but there are so many whose names we don't know. People who went to prison during the Vietnam War as not draft dodgers, as media would put it. There we go with the words again, but draft resistors. And if we can give examples, and again, Muhammad Ali is such a great one, somebody who was vilified at the time. And then with the wisdom of hindsight, we see how heroic their actions were.
Yes, no doubt. Well, Howard Zinn often urged teachers to use Dalton Trumbull's novel, Johnny Got His Gun, to teach about the realities of war. And so I wanted to ask you if there are other resources that you think teachers should incorporate into their curricula to help them teach against pro-war propaganda, to help them make war visible.
It's such a powerful book. Johnny Got His Gun, and perhaps sometimes teaching or sharing it. We mentioned Dalton Trumbo. He was targeted by the McCarthy era and suffered as a result, as those who challenged institutionalized violence so often do. I think in tandem of that book, also of Born on the 4th of July. And I was lucky enough to meet Ron Kovic, and his book is such a powerful call for peace, for dealing with realities of war. And if students are not familiar with the book, they more likely are familiar with the film, which was perhaps the best star turn that Tom Cruise ever provided to the world. The film, Born on the 4th of July, it's powerful and would bring home to people of that age or younger what's involved with going to war and the reality of it. And in terms of other resources, I think of in the current time, in real time, it's so infuriating to read the mainstream press in the United States, to watch the mainstream news. And as has been alluded to here, I think it's absolutely correct. The daily coverage by Democracy Now! Is just crucial. It is bringing us in real time the human realities of this war machinery as it bears down on exterminating people in Gaza. I'm a big fan of and have been a bit involved with the Media Watch group FAIR, which is online at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. The website is fair.org, just fair.org. And for decades now, FAIR has been analyzing news media bias. And one of the terrific things is it's like walking on two legs. FAIR analyzes and organizes activism. And so quite often when there's an analysis, whether it's the New York Times or NPR or anywhere else, they're very specific. They're very clear. It's fact-based. Often it's empirical. And then they say, you can send an email to this director of news at this media organization, so to pressure. And sometimes in a matter of hours, they have generated, for instance, hundreds of emails to the New York Times demanding a correction. and pointing out the inconsistencies and the flat out lies that are transmitted as actual journalism. And I think one of the benefits there is not only that it helps us to get more in the habit, so to speak, of being our own media critics, but also it says we don't have to just sit back and take it. We can organize effectively. We can talk back to our TV sets or our scroll or our newspapers or magazines. And also, if we wanted to, we could get out the picket signs and picket a media outlet that we think is inappropriate. There are a couple others I want to briefly mention. Commondreams.org, I think, is an excellent source of daily news and commentary, commondreams.org. And also, among the many silences that is so atrocious and outrageous in US media for the last 8 years is the slaughter of people in Yemen. And the fact that we've had 3 presidents, beginning with Obama, through Trump, through now Biden, who have winked and nodded and supported the Saudi-led slaughter of people in Yemen, the largest cholera epidemic in modern history inflicted by that war on Yemen. The UN says close to 400,000 people who have been killed in the last 8 years. The US involved with supporting through intelligence and weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, that killing, you may remember a year and a half ago, the fist bump that the President of the United States gave to the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. Talk about silences and affairs documented. You could watch MSNBC for years and barely see any mention of it whatsoever. And I would just add that at one level, we would say, well, gee, why isn't there coverage? Because the United States is involved. You would think in spite of the fact the US is involved, there's minimal to no coverage of this killing in Yemen. And yet, when you step back and you look at the patterns, it's even because the United States is involved that the silence has been maintained through the media here.
I know that's right. It's astounding that when the U.S. has interests in some region of the world, the abuses that they will turn a blind eye to. You know, my heritage is both Black and Armenian, and you know, growing up, I always knew that our government didn't recognize that there was a genocide perpetrated against my Armenian family. And it wasn't recognized for over 100 years until just recently, finally recognized because Turkey was an ally of the United States. And so those atrocities go overlooked, right? But I really appreciate you sharing those resources with us. And I hope that the educators here this evening will let us know how they're using those resources. So if you use one of the books, Johnny Got His Gun or Born on the 4th of July, or you start using Democracy Now! Or Fair and Accuracy in Reporting, if you use some of these resources in your classroom, send us a note at the Zinn Education Project and let us know how you're using it, so we can share that information with other educators across the country.
Something I forgot to mention in
Yeah.
connection with Yemen, a resource there, which is fantastic, is something, an organization called the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. And on their website, they're very clear. They have tremendous information, slideshows and so forth. So Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation brings us up to speed on what's really happening in that country and the relationship with the United States.
Wonderful. Yeah, I would love to hear from teachers if they begin teaching about Yemen, how that goes and what they teach. So I just have one last question that we'll wrap up with this wonderful conversation. You write that in the media, quote, militarism is euphemized, accepted, internalized, and honored with silence, if not praise. Habits of abstraction, buffering, and blocking human connection enable continual war and scarcely glimpsed consequences for people who are unseen and unacknowledged. So how would you respond to teachers who ask how they can teach a curriculum that centers the reality of war, but does not at the same time depress students or destroy their hopes?
When I think of that, I pull out from my files a quote from Noam Chomsky, because hope is so crucial, and we don't we can't really live without hope. And for young people or any people to feel hopeless is just, it's a non-starter. And this is what Noam Chomsky said. If you assume that there is no hope, you guarantee that there will be no hope. If you assume there is an instinct for freedom, that there are opportunities to change things, then there is a possibility that you can contribute to making a better world. And in the long run, I think while it's understandable that people will say, this is too depressing, I can't wrap my mind around it, it brings me down to try to learn what's happening in the world. Paradoxically, and we can share these experiences with people, what is the most depressing, the most debilitating in terms of feeling some hope and optimism to the world is to be passive. And that when we engage, when we connect with the humanity of others, when we work together, when we find ways to be organizing and be proactive about the future instead of consuming dreadful history like it's, Wonder Bread on the shelf, it's enlivening. And we're not going to be told that by news media, but the fact is, when we're activists, we're going to feel much better, quite likely, about the way the world is and can be than whether we, on the other hand, just consume the bad news.
Yeah. Thank you so much for lifting my spirits this evening, and I bet a whole lot of other people. I mean, it's just been an impossible time to see this genocide being perpetrated against the Palestinians and in Gaza, and it's so hard to see these images day in and day out. But we do have a way to resist, and we've had an amazing conversation about how to do that this evening. So I want to thank you deeply from my heart for helping us in this conversation learn how to resist better.
Well, I really want to say that the Zinn Education Project is really inspiring, and I can't think of a better organization to be named after in tribute to Howard Zinn, because Howard Zinn Presente, he's here and he's enlivened by this organizing and also rethinking schools and teaching for peace. This is how we can elevate our lives. So thanks for all you're doing to everybody on this call.